Good afternoon, Matt.
Hey, Graham, nice to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome, everyone, to the Crazy in Love podcast, where two therapists have a look at all things to do with modern relationships. Today, Matt, we're going to have a good look at divorce, but come at it from a slightly unique angle in terms of building on a podcast conversation you heard, and some questions about marriage counselling, about the state funding of marriage counselling and its links to divorce rates, etc., that we thought it would be useful just to have a bit of a back and forth about and try and make our way through that from a more kind of psychological point of view. Do you want to just tell us about that conversation and some thoughts and questions it sparked for you, and we'll go from there?
Yeah, sure. I think one step back, I think you and I don't often talk, or certainly don't on this podcast, talk about the kind of policy implications for what we do and what you might want to, what you might want to advocate for, or what would be a sensible kind of provision of psychological services. I think we've sort of taken ourselves out of that conversation.
Which is quite odd given our policy backgrounds, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's what we used to do for a day job, and then try and solve like difficult problems, try and get on the front foot on things, try and prop things up that were falling over in the kind of public place. So that's a question of, I suppose, how you intervene, if you intervene, in the sort of private lives of couples, was being discussed on Ezra Klein's podcast, and he had a guest on who was talking about Andrew Yang, who you might remember ran as presidential candidate in 2020. So he's a Democratic,
an independent candidate, was he? Or was he?
I think, but I think he was definitely aligned with Democrats at some point. We'd have to double check what the kind of timings on that were. But basically, like one of
it was quite connected with kind of tech bros, libertarian side of the fence, right?
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, and I guess what he proposed around divorce kind of interesting was it's not the most liberal, laissez-faire, hands-off stance, right? He proposed marriage counselling should be fully subsidised when he ran in 2020. So before people get divorced, there should be a kind of requirement for them to step through that process, and that should be state funded, which is quite an unusual stance in American politics to take. I mean, obviously he wasn't successful, but what was interesting about the podcast was that Ezra Klein himself was kind of very interested in that idea, and broadly, I think, supportive towards it, and so was his guest, who was coming at things from a very different political perspective. You're much more conservative in terms of his politics. Ezra Klein is sort of left or centre left leaning, depending on how you think about those things. And then it just got me thinking about why that hadn't come up in UK politics, like why I hadn't. I mean, maybe I'll pause in a second, invite you to give your reflections, but I hadn't seen that really come up as a policy proposal, a serious policy proposal in UK politics. And there's probably a little bit of context, there that's worth talking about, but never really was a serious thing. So very quickly, like when the divorce and dissolution separation bill came in 2020, it was proposed as an amendment to that we would fully fund in the same way that was being proposed in the US, but it didn't happen.
Do you know if that was a government introduced amendment or?
No, I don't think it was.
Okay.
No, I'm pretty certain it was not.
Okay.
So, but we'd probably be getting a bit too deep into politics to kind of.
Yeah, I just wondered if it was a kind of government proposed idea or whether it was something else. It doesn't seem like it was ever in the UK a kind of government proposed idea for state funding.
No, it wasn't, because the sort of the way the government kind of trade off these sort of proposals is to make an alternative proposal, or to give the proposee something of what they're asking for. So in this situation, the government acknowledged the importance of relationship support, and the practical action was the DFE, the Department for Education, would allocate, I think, 2.5 million to fund research into how best to integrate family support into the emerging family hubs model.
Oh, that sounds like kicking a drop in the ocean and kicking it into the long grass, or whatever analogy you want to use, isn't it? It's kind of
back in the day, you and I would have been like, "Oh, this is small beer. Like, no one's going to." This 2.5 million out of the education budget is like, I don't know, it's like us finding like a fiver to give to the kids.
Exactly. It's kind of paying off a backbencher so they can go back to their constituents and say they fought the good fight and they won 2.5 million in funding for for
Yeah.
couple counselling that doesn't really get you much in
Yeah.
the grand scheme of things, really.
I think that was the premise really for the conversation. Like, it's interesting, isn't it, that I think you and I will believe in what we do. Like, large part of our work is with couples as well as seeing individuals. Like, it's probably the focus of my work at the moment, truthfully, and I think it's where we've got kind of long-term interest in what we tend to write about. And yet, I don't know. It sort of prompts a thought, doesn't it? Like, how effective would that be? You know, if you did have that kind of intervention up front before people marry, during maybe the first 6 months of marriage, while you're settling into those new routines, and if you mandated it like ahead of divorce, for example, like would that be a good idea? And why doesn't it get talked about? And why isn't it such a prominent feature of UK life? Because broadly, I think most people think marriage is a good idea and divorce is very painful and costly at an individual and societal.
Yeah. And maybe we can feed that into this conversation, which is, why would a government or a state even consider this, right? And it would be because of the societal, economic, political consequences of divorce.
Yeah.
We can maybe come on to that. It sparked a couple of thoughts for me. One is around, and maybe we can draw this into the conversation, the idea of kind of the state providing any kind of mental health intervention on a more universal basis across the piece. So there's obviously a lot of talk at the moment about schools-based counselling, schools-based mental health interventions that tend to be universal. And by that, I mean, obviously everyone gets it rather than those most in need. But then it also made me think about state funding of mental health per se, and our ideas, for example, along the way of maybe the state contributing to some sort of annual mental health MOT for people, in the same way that they might get a physical health check. And the state provides that on a physical basis. So inevitably, there's a lot of conversation in our industry about what the government or a state should provide its citizens in terms of taking care of their mental health. I think that it's such a difficult conversation to wrap your head around, partly because so much of our industry exists in the private sector at the moment. There is a bit provided by charities. There's not much provided by the state. The vast majority of therapy and mental health support comes into the private sector rather than into the NHS, unless it's
and that's I didn't want to stop you, but like, that's really very pronounced when it comes to couples therapy as well. Like, literally the provision for that, except in the most rare of circumstances where someone is identified as a drug user and the partner is seen as an effective person to moderate that behavior. But a normal couple having communications problems or difficulties in their sex life or problems with managing the children wouldn't get anywhere near a therapist.
No, absolutely not. The kind of questions that inevitably come to my mind when I'm considering any kind of state provision is, what's the problem you're trying to solve, number one. So I guess here it would be, what are the consequences of couples having unhappy relationships? Why should we care about it? Then it becomes kind of more around the practicalities of, what's the evidence about the intervention? How much would this cost, and what would you get for that amount of money? Because ultimately we're talking about taxpayers' money here, hard-earned taxpayers' money that can go on other health services or education. Why on earth would you spend that on something that couples dip into their pockets all the time to pay for in the private sector?
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
let's start with the kind of the problem, almost like why.
I don't know if you have those numbers to hand that were in, I think were in the blog post that you did a few weeks back on this. There was like some, it was a really high figure, wasn't it, in terms of like question about how you actually accurately estimate the societal cost of marital breakdown. But someone has put a number on it, and it's a big number, right? So I guess there's a spend to save argument there potentially. I don't know whether that's been carefully considered. I would imagine the cost of an intervention along these lines is pretty steep.
Yeah, I was looking before we press record. I was having a look at some of the longitudinal studies on divorce impacts on children, for example, and really quite high correlations between future drug and alcohol abuse, future behavioral problems, including incarceration in future years, worse educational outcomes, worse relationship outcomes in their adult life, etc., to a greater or lesser degree. I mean, some of the correlations are quite small, and you've always got to be quite cautious about whether without the obvious cause and effect being spelled out, whether it's just some sort of genetic disposition or some sort of other factor playing into it. But I think that the bulk of the experts in the area would say that divorce has a negative consequence for the children of divorce in a range of different ways. The evidence on the life satisfaction of those people who even go through divorce is quite telling, in that only about 50% of people are content with their lives or happy with their lives after divorce. There's no improvement in happiness and life satisfaction rates for people who divorce or people who stay in relationships that aren't perfect but don't lead to the divorce.
Just let me make sure I got that right. I thought what you were saying was life satisfaction for the people who get divorced is maybe not what you would expect it to be. They don't go on to realize, like, I don't know, hitherto unforeseen opportunities that they feel that they come to regret that decision almost.
Yes, or certainly they don't see it as a massively positive decision in their life, and the evidence about their future relationships as well is quite telling. So of the relationships after divorce that end in marriage, I think the number was something like about 1 in 10 or 1 in 15 or something along those lines. So small numbers of post-divorce relationships end in what we would consider from the outside. Obviously, you can have a happy relationship that doesn't end in divorce, but of those that end in divorce, the number is quite small. All of that evidence suggests obviously a mixed picture, but one that I think we can safely say not only are there economic and political consequences of divorce, I think there's also kind of the broader sense of life satisfaction for those individuals and the children of divorce that we need to throw into the mix as well, because I think it's the government's job to think about the satisfaction of their population, not just the kind of the bare numbers of economic returns.
Yeah, no, I was, when you were talking, there was sort of triggering a few thoughts. I think one of the things that was quite sweet on the Ezra Klein podcast is he's not a very sort of self-disclosing person, but he talked about his parents' divorce a little bit and that they were at war. You know, they were at loggerheads, and he thought that had been helpful, and that in the instance he was referring to there, they'd probably been best all round. And I mean, who can gainsay that, right? And the person he was talking to on the podcast, obviously he's not opining on that, but in the round, when you aggregate out, actually, unless it's a really high conflict marriage and there are really serious concerns within the marriage, usually it doesn't bring a benefit to the children. And what you're saying there as well is it might also not actually bring a benefit to those parties. And often, of course, one person doesn't want to be getting divorced either. So bound up in that is not only the person choosing or like the couple agreeing. Like sometimes there is they're not in agreement. One person would like to work and would like to try and save the marriage, or would like to stick with it, or doesn't see where the problems are.
Yes, I think that's spot on. When we tend to think about a divorcing couple, I think in our minds we carry the idea of a confrontational, quite tempestuous relationship, possibly with some sort of domestic abuse involved even. And obviously at those extreme ends of relationship breakdown, it probably is beneficial for the vast majority of individuals involved and the children of those relationships as well. But the vast majority of divorces are just normal people in normal relationships where one person or both people is profoundly unhappy in certain ways and wants to leave. And I think that's where we would be contemplating the state getting involved in providing some sort of couples counselling. I was also looking before the call at an old BBC study. It's a good 20 years or so old now, but their evidence suggested that about 75% or 3/4 of couples would acknowledge that they've had significant problems at some point in their relationship, but only 8% of those couples had sought some sort of outside help through couples counselling. So it suggests a big differential between the number of people in the country who have profound relationship problems of some sort that could benefit from a bit of help. They're not getting that help either through stigma or through lack of money to afford it or lack of time or whatever it might be. But there's something there that tells you that this is potentially a public policy problem, not just an individual relationship problem.
Yeah, and what that bit of legislation that I was referring to earlier, the legislation in the UK, what that principally introduces, the divorce, dissolution, and separation
rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, absolutely. It's wonderful, isn't it? Someone dreamt that up whole long line of people agreed that, yeah, that's perfect.
Of all the options.
Let's call it that. That introduces the no fault divorce, as you would know it. So there's something about there's something important there, I think, in that kind of marker that it makes divorce in some ways easier and less stigmatized. Good thing, and also potentially, a less good thing, easier to get out of, a thing that you can dissolve relatively quickly. So that amendment around the suggestion for bringing in, therapy, counselling, advice giving, that kind of moment of pause and reflection was almost counter to the essence of that legislative act.
Yeah, interesting. What's your thoughts on the kind of the potential timing of any intervention? So some of our thoughts around the mental health MOT were, let's advocate for intervening in someone's life in a positive way along their lifespan and in various ways that might be more preventative rather than having to deal with a really problematic situation. Whereas the Andrew Yang proposal seemed to me to be much more of a kind of end of relationship intervention to try and help a couple find an alternative route out. I would have thought that any sort of genuinely useful intervention is more kind of topping couples up along the way and helping problems before they get out of hand, rather than that you're about to get divorced, here's 6 sessions of couples therapy to try and help you resolve some of these issues. Personally,
I'd agree. And then it feels like it spirals, doesn't it? And it feels like a business from people like you and me who've seen the gravy train.
Who've got a great business idea on the back of an envelope, but have got no idea of how to roll it out across the country. Yeah.
Really, I mean, it's just really expensive as well, isn't it?
Massively.
Imagine kind of intervention costing, even if you could get the cost right down at the bottom end of a private sector market for that, it's just a fortune. I think that for me is sort of, if somebody was to say, why hasn't this come up in 20 years of working in government in and around those kind of issues, like the Ministry of Justice, the department that I know best houses all of that sort of all of the kind of apparatus to do with family law. Why haven't we seriously considered this? There's one really obvious answer, which is it costs a fortune.
And then if you try and make it work without it costing a fortune, then you're going to be charging 30, 40 or paying 30, 40 quid a session for a counsellor. You're not going to be attracting those who have proven through their work over the years in one way or another that they're the best at it.
I agree. I think it just does require somebody a bit more seasoned who knows their way around this, So we probably would say that, wouldn't we? Because we want to think of ourselves as being in that category and, providing a service which is highly valuable to people. But I think you are talking there, if you're talking about upfront costs, like checking in that the marriage is kind of a sensible union, checking that it's going well, checking after year 1 or year 5 or whatever we might say, and then putting something at the back end, that really is a massively expensive intervention. So anecdotally, like lots of divorce lawyers would say, before pressing the button on divorce, pause and get those sessions. And I get the instinct, I absolutely agree in principle, but I think what you and I would say in all sorts of domains is come early, come at the point at which this is salvageable. Don't come at the back end. Don't come when it's broken. And if you're using the MOT and thinking of vehicles or even health, early intervention, right? The warning light on the dashboard is blinking. Don't ignore it and jump on the motorway and take a family holiday. You've got to sort that out, haven't you? And what you really want is not, you just want a program of servicing that catches that almost before it comes up. That's the way to steward your vehicle purchase properly. It's the way to steward your health.
There's the Christian model, of course, as well, isn't there, of the pre-marriage sessions to mark and manage that transition into being a married couple, that I think is something that doesn't seem to really be modeled anywhere else. I've never seen it kind of advertised in the private sector, this kind of, you're about to get married, come for 6 to 10 sessions to really understand how that might affect you, or even the kind of pre-baby stuff of how are you going to handle this as a couple. You don't really tend to find these transition points marketed or built up as an intervention, either in the private sector or by governments around the world, which
I agree. I think in the work that I'm doing, I would have previously been a bit disparaging of that
Mm.
model, but
What? Why? Why?
yeah, I mean, I'm just less likely now to see it as sort of illiberal nonsense. It feels like a very helpful thing, and it feels like sort of a connection with sort of ancient wisdom, that this is inherently challenging and difficult. And like we're not just talking about how it's going to be hard. We're also talking about how to maximize it, how to really draw the benefit of this, and what other area would you turn down, kind of free advice or the opportunity to think hard about something that was very important to you and that was going to last you potentially, decades, if not an entire lifetime. It seems to me now to be almost commonplace. I was looking at like sort of slight tilt maybe, but I was looking at some research, Pew study that found that Americans, it's an American study, 71% thought that having a job or career that they enjoy was the kind of principal path to fulfillment, and that getting married was the path to fulfillment for only 23% of those people. And it's really, I think it's really, because it's such stark figures, it just made me think that's an interesting shift, isn't it? That we think our job and our career will bring us more satisfaction than the person we choose to spend our life with. And I think that is it's a miscalculation, right, in my terms.
Yes, although I imagine what's happening in those kind of surveys is that people are thinking about happiness and day-to-day contentment rather than life satisfaction. So you
Yeah.
get what you get the kind of, is it the inverted U or the U-shaped curve
Yeah.
of married people tending to be, and particularly those with children, finding certain years between kind of 40 and 60 particularly difficult, and not on a day-to-day basis necessarily that wonderful, but they report their life satisfaction generally being pretty high. And I wonder if something similar happens in those surveys, so that people think that actually on a day-to-day basis, what I need for my own sense of purpose and own sense of well-being is work that makes me happy and work that makes me driven. The
Yeah.
relationship feels like a nice bolt-on extra, whereas I think we come from more of a school of thought of, your relationships are more important than you think. The
Yeah.
number one factor of people's reported high life satisfaction is fulfilling and deep relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And that the principal one, usually the centerpiece for most people, is their romantic
Yeah,
relationship. That
yeah,
feels just
yeah,
statement of the
yeah.
uh, obvious, I suppose, that's kind of
Although
brought.
mine is the business relationship with you, of course.
Well, same. I mean, that didn't really need saying, did it?
I
I,
wanted everyone to hear it, though. It felt important for me to make that.
I think there's something about when you get divorced, you think all the problems go away. And when there are children or money involved, that's really not the case. What I'm saying to couples quite often is that if you're arguing about the kids and you're thinking divorce will end that argument about the kids, it really won't. It will halve your worldly wealth. It will introduce new partners into the mix, potential new dad or new part-time
Yeah.
child, the complexity of blended families, and then all of those decisions about where you school them, how much sport they do, to what level, how they use their free time, which school you go to, where you continue living in the country. And then, we've got celebrations to mark GCSEs and A levels and graduation and marriage. It just never stops, right? It won't do quite what you think it will do. So unless those problems are really genuinely irreconcilable, you might want to think about whether there is a serious conversation to be had about whether some of this can be fixed or accommodated, or
Yeah, and even then, there might be people listening to this thinking that's all well and good, but will couples therapy genuinely help? So, they might have. I was reading recently, and listeners might have read something similar from Arnold Schwarzenegger saying that yes, he regrets having his affairs and he regrets the divorce from his wife, but he also thought couples therapy was a crock of shit. Like he thought he was being encouraged to be like
yeah.
embrace his feminine side and talk about feelings and try and all of that stuff. And he thought it was absolute nonsense and more damaging than actually helpful. And I imagine there's quite a lot of people that still feel the same, that, what, we don't need to open up all of these problems again. Why should we just open up the problems that probably make divorce more likely rather than less likely?
Yeah, I think that's right, isn't it? I think we probably want to take issue with some of that sort of caricature of what couples therapy is about. And I think you and I would say bring a harder edge
Yeah.
That, and it isn't wallowing in feelings or, you know, indulging, you know, one or other party's kind of like slight upset or preference in the relationship, but doing something which is much more fundamental than that. I guess some of what I'm saying to couples is, are these irreconcilable differences? That feels quite practical. And is it worth an experiment? Is it worth trying to work on them? Is it worth moving? Is it worth both of you trying to go first with a change in behavior rather than
Mm-hmm.
thinking and talking? For me, it's
Mm-hmm.
always about behavior. And then
Interesting.
you can divorce later, right? Which is sort of what I would say as well. I think that line is from a book called The Art of Marriage Maintenance.
Mm.
And it's like, you can keep that in your back pocket. It's what divorce lawyers often say anecdotally as well. Like, try some other stuff. You can always get divorced another day. Like, sort of kick the arse out of that. Like, you know, are you dead sure about this? Are you absolutely certain the grass is greener?
I think if I was sitting here 30, 40 years ago, I think I would be saying to people the evidence around couples therapy is pretty crap.
Yeah,
And
right. Yeah.
the couples therapy often is just about kind of you go, then you go, then you go, then you go, and you're just kind of repeating your feelings and resentments about the other person without really taking things forward very much. I think couples therapy has moved on leaps and bounds in the last 20
Yeah.
years or so.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. And what I find as well, which continues to surprise me, is really smart people in the world who are often doing like very big, important jobs, sophisticated things for a living, find it very, very hard to talk about what they want in the relationship and what's going wrong. So just simple sort of formulations of how to speak to one another, basic kind of rules of courtesy that they probably do observe at work and that they would, you know, insist were imperative to relationships with their clients or whatever else, go by the wayside in the intimate relationship. And often I think that is because they've come from homes which haven't modeled that in any way, shape,
Yeah.
or and part of
Yeah.
that, you know, parents at war when they were growing up, or, you know, sulking or huffing or nothing being discussed, or nobody's allowed to raise their voice, or everything's conducted behind closed doors, or it's a madhouse of shouting and conflict.
Mm.
Rather than, of course, we see things differently. Of course, there's going to be trade offs. Of course, dad is frustrated with mum, vice versa in this situation. But that isn't catastrophic. It's just one of those things, and we'll work through it.
Where, just to finish up the conversation, where do you end up, do you think, on this kind of public policy question? So as we've been talking, and I was thinking in advance of our conversation briefly, it made me reflect on our education system more generally, and the kind of the attempted rebalance, but I think so far unsuccessful rebalance towards some sort of greater depth of emotional skills and relationship skills embedded from quite early on in our society and culture and its education system, that is more necessary for public policy and governments to grapple with, rather than more potentially costly and difficult to get right interventions that require the likes of us to try and help couples out right at the end of all of that. I'd be interested in your thoughts, though.
I don't know. I mean, I don't want to end on this note because it's too gloomy, but it's a bit of a candle of despair from me, I think, on that. Like, I believe that sort of intervention up front in the early stages and on an ongoing basis, and definitely at the back end where things have gotten really difficult, is massively helpful. I think it's sort of crucial for many, many couples who haven't had a head
Yeah.
start doing that and haven't had the model. And it's really how my own life has unfolded as well.
Yeah,
For
interesting. Yeah.
that's But I don't see how you do that from a public policy point of
Yeah.
view, because I mean, not just right now, even when you and I joined government, where, you know, there were
The
rich
cash was flowing.
and the cash was flowing and it was all going to get better under new Labour. Even then, there wasn't money for this kind of thing. You and I have thought about business opportunities in this area, how you would, you know, spread out what we do more widely rather than just talking to couples over a 50-minute session or whatever it might be. You know, how do you make this go wider and spread it further? And we spend some of our time talking to other people who are having business ideas and want to consult with somebody who's got expertise in this area, and we almost always end up at the same point. It's impossible to see how you would do it without cost. It reminds me really of my time working in criminal justice, where some of the answer to what goes on in prison and what goes wrong, and how you give people a second chance to reintegrate them into society and rehabilitate them, does really depend on a slug of funding that no one is willing to find.
Mm.
But let's not end there. Give us the hopeful
Well,
message.
I guess the hopeful vision is more along the lines of, made me think while you were talking of the Sure Start model, right? Where you've got community centers that are hubs of advice, support, but not in a kind of staid 1970s government office, in a genuinely kind of community hub of which kind of relationship advice, relationship intervention through counselling and couples work might exist. I think if you did it as a kind of more means tested, community focused hub, I could see a way that it would work within that funding model. But it's an investor save problem, isn't it? It's, if you invest the money now, you will see the benefits in 20, 30 years time. Governments at the moment across the Western world don't tend to think with that mindset. We see it from pensions through transport infrastructure to all sorts of things. So that the risky decisions to invest up front are hard. And if I'm honest, I think the evidence around couples therapy as an intervention is probably not robust enough to convince any government ministers that it's a risk worth taking at this point.
No, the maybe my final thought, if it's okay to add one more thing, the conversation between Ezra Klein and the academic he was talking to, a guy called Patrick Deneen, was Ezra Klein was putting him on the spot for policy interventions, and Patrick Deneen said he doesn't really think in terms of policy interventions. That's not quite what he does. He thinks sort of culturally. So there's a book called Get Married, which is you published quite recently, and it argues for marriage playing a crucial factor in your personal happiness and fulfillment, as opposed to those kind of career achievements, and that young adults should invest as heavily in that, in finding a suitable spouse as they do their education and careers, and parents should support them in that, and schools and colleges, etc., etc. And I suppose that sort of broadens it out, that it's not just pounds, shillings and pence for policy interventions. It's also like the culture of the conversation, like no fault divorce. We talk about divorce in kind of quite an accepting way, in quite a casual way, and some of that would need to change as well. Some of that sense of marriages go through phases, and that kind of very romantic, really into one another phase is exactly that. It's a phase. It's great to have. It's a lot of fun, but it's not going to sustain you through the duration of a marriage. And it's absolute idiocy to believe that, right? There's another phase, which for lots of people is about parenthood. And then there's probably a back end where the kids go, and it's more about companionship, that we talk in an unrealistic way about marriage, or we don't really talk very much about it. It feels a bit sort of Radio 4 thought for the day kind of marriage. We're a bit shy. I think even in this conversation, we're a bit shy about being advocates for marriage, and being a bit down on divorce because it feels a bit illiberal and a bit judgy, but maybe that needs to tilt and shift as well.
Yes, interesting thoughts for another conversation. We're contactable at crazyinlovepodcastuk@gmail.com. Let us know if you've got any jazzy, affordable public policy interventions that we hadn't thought about that are going to reduce the level of divorce in the UK and across the world. That'd be good. Always good to see you, Matt. See you soon.
Yeah, nice to see you. Take care.
Bye.